Before I even start hanging doors, before I do a thing to an opening, I like to know what the high point of the floor is, and I like to establish a control line in order to discover what the high point of the floor is. Because there's one thing I don't like doing when I'm setting finish on a house. I don't like reaching for a Sawzall. The first thing I do is I shoot a control line. It's really easy to do. I'm using a Stabila LAX 300 laser here. It's a really nice little pocket laser, and it has an on-off switch. It's off right now. You cannot hear the pendulum, but if you turn it on, you can hear the pendulum. That's because it's not just an on-off switch, it's a pendulum lock too. You want to be sure when you buy a laser that it has an on-off switch that also locks the pendulum. So this laser has two lines. It's got a vertical line and a horizontal line, and it also has plumb dots. There's a dot shooting down to the floor here, and there's a dot that shoots up to the ceiling. So with one laser, I can do almost everything as a finished carpenter that I need to do. And what I need to do right now with this opening is shoot a control line. That's the first step I always take when I set interior doors and windows. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So all I have to do is put a pencil line right on the laser on this side of the opening, and I'll put the same pencil line at this side of the opening too. Now, all I have to do is go around the rest of the house and mark pencil lines on the laser line at every single window and door opening for the whole house. And if I have to, I'll take that ladder with me. If I have to, I'll reposition the ladder and I'll shoot that laser line back to this reference mark, to this benchmark, and raise it or lower it with shims until it's dialed right back into this mark so I can continue that line throughout the whole house. That is a control line. And with a control line, you can find the high point of the floor. And it's really neat to find the high point of the floor before you start installing windows and doors, rather than waiting until after. Because if you wait until after, you end up carrying a Sawzall. So now all I have to do to find the high point of the floor is measure down to that control line. Like right here on this side of the opening, I've got 36 5/8. And on this side of the opening, I've got 36 3/4. So this side of the door is the floor at this side of the door is a little bit higher than it is over here. Remember, it's the smallest number that's the high point of the floor. But really, I'm not concerned too much about 1/8 of an inch between these two sides of the door. What I want to find are any openings in the house that are much higher, like let's say 1/2 inch higher or 1 inch or 3/4, and it happens all the time. I want to find the high point of the floor before I set any doors or windows. And by measuring down to the control line, I can do that. Now let's say this was the high point of the floor. Then I'd like to do a little math at that opening. The opening that's at the highest point of the floor. Just a little bit of arithmetic. In order to do that simple arithmetic, I need to know the measurement from the bottom of the sill on the pre-fit doors to the inside at the top of the head. The top of the head on the inside of the jamb, not the OD of the jamb, but from the bottom of the threshold to the inside of the jamb. And let's say that's 82. We'll put a mark right there. The ID of the head jamb, because that's where the casing's registered. You know, it's 1/4 of an inch higher than the ID of the head jamb. And that's what I'm after here. I want to make sure the casing's going to line up from window to window, from door to door, from the interior doors to the exterior doors, and the exterior windows too. Because if it doesn't, if you've got an interior pre-hung door and the casing on that pre-hung door is 1 inch lower or 1 inch higher than the window that's right next to it, it looks really stupid. And then I want to measure back down from that measurement mark down to my control line. Now that measurement here is 45 5/8. That is the magic number for this whole job. I can cut a stick of wood 45 5/8, and it could be a piece of like doorstop or a piece of 1x2, and I could walk around the rest of the house and I could take that stick of wood and I could put it right on my measurement mark, right on the control line, and then I could slash the top of it with a pencil line. And that would give me a level line at the heads of every single window and door throughout the whole house. And that would make installing the jambs much easier. I'd never have to hold a level over my head, and I'd be able to take a jamb, put it up against the opening, lift it up until the inside of the jamb is flush to that pencil line, and tack it to the wall, flush to the wall on both sides, and good to go. Now, I don't shoot control lines for every single door I set. There's lots of times when I'm hanging just 1 or 2 doors on a remodel, and then I use a little short level like this. I don't like standing there with a level over the top of my head and a nail gun hanging off my belt, holding on to a jamb, trying to hold it level across the top and flush to the wall and try and get a nail through it at the same time. I mean, it's a waste of time. You just aren't going to really be able to achieve any of that easily. Instead, I do this the smart way. I level the floor first before I bring the jamb into the opening, so that the head is level as soon as I set the jamb in the opening. And the way to do that is just take a shim, put it underneath the level, and get that bubble vial centered right in the vial so that the level's dead on. Now, with this shim, you can measure the thickness of that shim. Whatever thickness it took to get that bubble right in the center of the vial is exactly the amount you need to cut off this side of the jamb leg in order to level the head. Or, if the finished floor isn't in yet, and you're just working off a rough floor, you could take the shim and just leave it in the opening and set the jamb right on top of it, and the head jamb would be level as soon as you set it in the opening. There's one more step we got to make. We got to prepare the opening, at least the width of the opening too. Most rough openings are framed 2 inches over the size of the door. That's the nominal size of the door, and a lot of them are framed 2 1/4 or 2.5 inches over. The framers like to do that just in case the walls are out of plumb. They're never really sure, you know. Just in case the walls are out of plumb, you'll have plenty of wiggle room in there to plumb up the jambs, but it's a pain in the neck to do it, especially if you're the kind of carpenter that takes a big stack of shims and sticks it against a trimmer and drives a nail through it. As soon as you put a nail through this big pile, they're going to split. And besides, once you put a nail through it, you can't adjust them. So this is just a waste of time. There's no precision to this. Instead, what we do is we cut plywood shims like these. These are made out of 1/4 inch plywood, but the important thing is they're all 3.5 by 3.5, so you can stick them onto the jack studs of the trimmers in any direction you want. And we cut them out of 1/4 inch, out of 1/8 inch, out of 3/8, 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4, every bit of plywood scrap we find on a job site. We throw them into a milk crate, and whenever we go to set pre-hung doors, we just grab that milk crate. That's like the most important tool we take. And the first thing we do when we come to a rough opening in is we bring it in. Sometimes I'll have a 1/4 inch shim up here and a 3/4 inch shim down there. Or I'll have 2/4 inch shims up here. It doesn't matter, whatever it takes to get it plumb. And while I'm getting it plumb, I'm also really careful to make sure that this new rough opening stays centered, especially if I'm working in a hallway. If you're working in a hallway, you want to make sure that after you put the casing on, you have an equal amount of wall reveal between the back of the casing and the adjoining walls on both sides of the doorway. So that's why you want to keep it centered. And while you're working in this new rough opening, because that's really what you're doing, you're creating a new rough opening, you want to make sure that that new rough opening is about 1/8 of an inch over the OD of the jamb. Most jambs measure about 1.5 inches. Actually, they're a little less than that because these days they're not even made out of 3/4 inch stock. But just figure about 1.5 inches, and that means that your opening should be about 1 5/8 inches over the size of your door. And that way, when you bring your jamb over, it'll just fit into that new rough opening with a little bit of wiggle room. It won't slop all over the place, and you'll be able to get right to work setting it without a big pain in the neck. I only want to put shims at the very top of the jamb and at the very bottom, right near the floor. Some carpenters put blue tape on their levels so they'll know exactly where the hinges are going to go. And that way, when they pre-shim an opening like this, they can shim directly behind each one of the hinges. And I know this because I used to do it this way myself, and then I got in trouble with a crew of pro door hangers. You never want to shim directly behind the hinges because it limits your ability to adjust the door and the jamb to fit perfectly so that you get even hinge gaps from the bottom of the door to the top of the door. So the jamb just fits in the opening with a little bit of wiggle room, so it'll stay in there. And I still got the screw in on this side, so I want to remove that screw, but I want to wait until the door is in the rough opening before I pull the screw. Because every time you pull this screw out, or sometimes your doors will be pre-bored and they'll have a plug in them, and every time you pull that plug out, the door kind of settles down. And I like to have it in the rough opening before the door settles down, because it gets a little awkward to deal with. Now, I'm just going to flush this jamb up. So now that this jam's in here, all I need are 2 shims to pin the jamb in the opening so it'll stay where I want it. And if I put them in exactly the right place, the whole job will be easy. And this is the right place, directly across the head jamb. Now I want to keep the head jamb flush with the wall. I'm just going to smack it back out so it's flush right here at the top, and flush over here. And then I'll smack that shim in a little bit more. And the beauty of this is, if you put those shims in exactly the right place, directly across from the head jamb, you can pressurize this jamb and pin it right into that opening. Now I can swing this door open and it'll stay there. The frame won't fall out of the opening, and I can start putting fasteners into this jamb. And this is where things get really specific. We're going to put in the first 5 fasteners, and they have to be put in exactly the right order and in exactly the right location, or the system won't work. Remember, this isn't like reinventing the wheel every time you set a door. The whole thing I'm showing you here is a system, a really simple system that will increase your productivity and your efficiency and guarantee you that you'll get really well-fitting doors quickly. Fastener number 1 goes in the very top of the jamb, not near the hinge, the very top of the jamb, just like so. Now before you put in fastener number 1, just make sure that that jamb is flush with the wall. That way it'll be easy to get your casing on and tie your miters in nice and tight. Now let's do fastener number 2. Fastener number 2 goes on the opposite side, right at the top of the jamb. Now I'm using screws because this is my Katz Roadshow set and I use this thing over and over again. If I was doing this on a job site, I'd be shooting 15 gauge 2.5 inch nails with my nail gun, and I'd probably fire 2 of them right up here, 1 here and 1 there. And the same for fastener number 1 over here on the side. So we're still doing the same thing though. You want your first 2 fasteners up at the very top of the jamb to hold it flush to the wall. Now fastener number 3 is really important. This gives you another opportunity to correct any cross leg that's left in the jamb. You're actually going to get 1 more chance after this when we set fastener number 4, but let's get as much cross leg out of here right now as we can. And the way to do that, before you drive that fastener in there, is take the door and set it against the jamb. We want to make sure that that door is sitting flat against the jamb now, from the very bottom of the jamb to the very top of the jamb. And notice up here right now that the door is sticking proud of the jamb. We can fix that before we put in fastener number 3. All we have to do is pull this jamb leg down here out of the wall just a little bit. I'm just going to grab the door and pull this jamb leg out of the wall just a hair. And it's going to help us put this door in here so it's perfectly flat against the jamb. So now we got fastener number 3 in, and we're ready to put in fastener number 4. And that goes in the very bottom of a strike jamb, right here. I'm just going to get it started. Okay, before I tighten this screw up, and this is fastener number 4, I want to check the jamb to make sure I correct any cross leg that's left in the wall. And I can do that real easily. All I have to do is close the door and position this jamb so that the door sits perfectly flat against the stop at the very bottom and all the way up to the top of the jamb. So that is fastener number 4. And now we're ready to put in fastener number 5. Fastener number 5 is so important. If you don't put it in at the right time, if you have a shim behind the hinge, it won't work. And the reason it's important is because it's the only way you can correct the hinge gap above the top hinge. There's no other way other than with fastener number 5. If you don't put a long screw through the hinge right now, you can't correct the hinge sag. And that's what happens when you put a fairly heavy door on a jamb like this. Sometimes you'll get a little play in the hinge. At the very least, you'll get some sag in the jamb too. And that sag in the jamb, that play in the hinge, will pull that door away from the top jamb, just above the top hinge. And you can see I can move that right now just with my hand. But if you put that long screw through this hinge, you'll pull that hinge back and tighten up this gap. And if you don't correct a large hinge gap above the top hinge with that long screw, then you're going to probably end up with too tight of a strike gap, and when you shut the door, it'll rub on the strike jamb. And you'll try to blame that on the pre-fitter too, when it's really your fault. Fastener number 5 goes into the upper hole on the hinge, the one that's closest to the stop. And you want to use that hole because you'll get the best bite in the framing back there. You'll grab onto that trimmer or that jack stud right in the middle. Instead of, if you use this hole, your screw might land right between the drywall and the stud.
A word of warning here on fastener number 5. Don't torque that thing down too hard, or you won't have any gap above the top hinge at all and your door will end up being jam bound. Just put a little bit of torque on that screw and you can adjust the top hinge gap very easily.
All right, now we got one more thing we got to correct before we can do this simple, easy stuff, which is just shimming the jamb all the way around. The last thing we got to correct is the hinge gap down here beneath the bottom hinge. And this gap down here is almost always too tight. And that's because most carpenters don't know how to adjust that hinge gap beneath the bottom hinge. It's kind of tricky, but it's actually really simple. Watch this. Now notice I'm putting this shim in just above the bottom hinge. As I put it in, the gap opens. As I take it out, the gap closes. This shim has a maximum amount of adjustment right here, but it only works if it's installed just above the bottom hinge. If you install this behind the hinge or below the hinge, it won't work well at all. But remember, it won't work, period, unless you put fastener number 3 in way at the bottom of the jamb and secure the bottom of that jamb to the framing before you put this shim in. Now that I've got this shim in and we've adjusted this gap here, now I can do the easy part. All I have to do now is put shims in all the way around the jamb and clean up the gaps everywhere else. I'd start with the hinge side and shim this jamb off really good, and then I'd move over to the strike side and shim off the strike side too, especially around the lock set and the deadbolt. I shim those areas big time. So that wraps up this short little program on how to set a pre-hung door. If you want to learn more about setting pre-hung doors, whether it's an interior or an exterior, pick up a copy of my DVD, the Door Hangers DVD. I produced this a couple of years ago, and you'll also learn from this DVD how to scribe, butt, and bevel a new door in an old jamb.